Welcome to the Online Business Launchpad podcast. I'm your host, Trudy Rankin. And today I have as my guest, Don Finley. Now, Don is a transformative force behind FINdustries, and I'll try and pronounce it correctly. It's FINdustries, which is a product development agency that has had a bit of an impact on the tech and financial sectors. And he's got some expertise in an area that I find really quite fascinating, which is the fusing of science, art, and technology, which doesn't always fit in there, that art bit, science, art, and technology, and basically using that as a way of propelling his agency forward in the industry and just making it stand out and be very impactful. And he's done a lot of things. It's been fascinating learning a little bit more about him, quite a few adventures, and basically he's developed his business to the place where he's able to help his clients generate over $1 billion in annual revenue. And that sounds really powerful and amazing. But what I liked was, for him, it's more than just about the money. There's a lot more to it than just that. And we'll get into that as we talk during our interview. And he's also a co-founder and advisor to startups, which I also find interesting. I'm going to ask him to talk a little bit about that later as we talk. But I wanted to bring you, Don, today just to get a sense of somebody who's done something pretty powerful, pretty big, and has had a lot of experience in building a business to quite a sizable size. And so, Don, thanks for being on the podcast and welcome.
Trudy, thank you so much for having me tonight. And I just really enjoy the opportunity to share what we've done, and hopefully somebody can find some nuggets in it for themselves as well.
So we'll get into it a little bit more, but some of the things that you've helped other people develop and shape are pretty interesting to me because I've heard of some of these things. I'm going, oh, that's cool. But before we jump into that, maybe just give people a little bit more of an idea about you, your background, where you're from, and how you got to the point where you got into this whole entrepreneurial journey.
I started FINdustries over 10 years ago. And really the impetus was I spent a good amount of time in the corporate world. I rose through the ranks and I was a VP of software for one organization, CTO for another, and got this feeling that all the outside development firms that I was hiring were very good technically. What they were missing out on was business acumen, or like an understanding of how the product is going to work in the market and helping customers to bridge that technical divide. We had a really strong product, or I was fortunate enough to work in organizations that have a really strong product background. And I was able to bring that into what FINdustries offers, so that we show up and we know your web app, the frameworks that are there, we know TensorFlow, we know all of the technical aspects of it. But additionally, we understand why you're doing it and help you bridge that connection between this is the idea and here's how I translate it into an actual product that works. So that was the thought that I had for the market that was necessary to help our clients bridge that gap into technology.
I just want to touch on that just a little bit more because in my background and with sort of various family members, I've had an interest in the process whereby universities, with their research, especially in the scientific area, find these incredible things that develop these amazing things that could potentially be products, but they don't have the skills to turn them into viable businesses, let alone a product. They can develop it to the point where it's almost ready for sale, but they can't take it past the business side of things. And you get these innovation hubs at the good universities. You get these innovation hubs where there's people who do know how to do that, but there's still so much scientific research that could have been monetized or turned into something that could be sold to help people that never sees the light of day because there just aren't those skills. So what is it about your background that does enable you to be able to sense and see? You've touched on it a little bit, but there's always more to it than just what you said. What more could you add to that conversation?
I was really fortunate early in my career that on the side of emerging technology. So like when I first graduated college, one of the first projects that I was put on was about e-notes. So when you go to buy a home, you have a note, right? And I was fortunate to be placed on the project that was actually implementing the first ever e-note. And I had the opportunity to sign that, or not even sign, click the button, right? And 20 years later, I'm advising a company that is doing something similar for another space, and come to find out that after 20 years is finally reaching adoption. For me, I think the key is looking at like how people are going to be interacting with your product, and then ensuring that you're constantly receiving feedback on that, because there is that gap between what is a scientific technology sort of advancement and how does it fit into people's lives. And I think time and time again, I had the opportunity to work with emerging technology and see the potential of it, but then ground it in like a real life example of what you could actually do with it. And you've got to bring the tech into a space where people can use it. I was advising a team of people the other month on how to use ChatGPT in their business, right? And one of the guys looks at me and goes, "Yeah, it's fantastic. I just use it like I use Google." And you're like, I guess you could do that, but at the same time, you're misusing it because it's not Google. It doesn't have factual information, but it can get creative. And so if you start to treat it like a really good intern in your business that has a number of skills that you may not be an expert at, but it can do some things, and dialogue with it, it becomes a lot more effective. And so what you see when you put a product out there and you start to gain feedback from your user base or your potential user base is you can adjust based on that. And that's what we've embodied, really making sure that we know where we're going with it.
The whole AI conversation, chat GPT conversation, I think is a really fascinating one and a really good example of, as I said, an emerging technology where it's been around for a long time in various guises. It just hasn't been as popularized, and it hasn't been as, the uses haven't been quite as obvious to the general public as they are starting to become now. There's a lot of different questions. I'll ask this one. For those people that you were advising, were they simply looking to use, you said they're using it like Google, but in terms of how they could be using it, let's put it that way. Was it more around taking an instance, a large language learning model, or the learning aspect of it, and having a specific instance that's private to that organization, and using it that way, plugging it into the database that they have and the data that's available, and then using it in smart ways? Or was it more about the external facing side where they're using it to help create content or whatever? Because there's two different paths you can take with AI.
We can talk about countless different ways that we can implement AI. What we're focused on now with ChatGPT and other large language models is utilizing it in a creative way to help people through new processes. Let's say we're working with a startup and we have a strong salesperson, a strong marketing person, and a strong tech person. Some of them will be asked to create information for, let's say, pitch decks, business plans, and whatnot. And we're using the large language model as basically a reviewer, right? And so instead of creating the document, sending it out, waiting a few days in order to get feedback, you're now writing the document, getting feedback almost instantly within 2 minutes while you're actually in the flow of that, and then able to continue on and iterate through. And then additionally, we send it out for feedback. We get the feedback. We can bring the feedback back in and incorporate that into the discussion as well. So that's one use case in which we're utilizing the conversational aspect of the large language models to help speed time to market for these teams. We're also looking at, or we've trained and also executed using it for content creation for external. And if you've dabbled in it, you can see with a little information, it probably gets it right 3% of the time. Actually, I saw this fact today that was just astonishing. If you ask ChatGPT to write SQL code for you to query a database, it gets the query right 3% of the time. If you give it the schema of the database, so how the tables are structured and the information is available, it gets it right 80% of the time. So a lot of what we help people with, or how we're training our team and how we train other teams as well, is how you utilize information prior to the question to help support it so that you get a better response.
I think that's really important. And also it's an interesting question for me because we're talking about percentages of time that is right. Now, obviously it's learning. There's the learning component to it. And do you think that there will come a time when, it's not just 80% of the time that it's right, it's 100% of the time? Or is there always going to be a need for somebody who understands how databases work, how schema work, how codes need to be developed so that it's clean, works efficient, and doesn't have security gaps in it?
I think that there's a time when uh, actually 100% is probably something that nobody could ever hit, because even as humans we can barely get to 100%. So we always look at what's that human level metric for this, and even in expert level you're probably still at 95%. There's a lot of times that I know I make mistakes, and that's really where the lessons come from. We've been in business for 10 years and I continue to make mistakes even as the founder of this and the CEO. I I'm not infallible, right? And that where I see improvements in AI going, we will get to a point where even if it is at 90, let's just say human level, we're already building processes inside of both how we interact with AI and how our applications interact, that it actually checks itself. And so you can get a model that's producing 80% results to get over 90 just by follow-up questions. And so asking it to critique its response helps it become a better, more well-rounded response as well.
That's really interesting. It raises one question for me, and I'll just say right now that I love emerging technology. I'm a proponent of tech, and I'm interested in AI. I'm interested in ChatGPT. But something that you just said just sparked a thought, and we learn by making mistakes. And if we have a tool that's doing all the work for us and the thinking for us, we're not going to be making mistakes. And how do we then learn? How do we actually keep moving forward and not start to stagnate in terms of our mental abilities and where we go in the future? I'm interested in your thoughts.
Oh my God, this is a fascinating question. In one way, we can look at it as we've had this dialogue as humans time and time again, where the advent of the computer, the advent of the calculator, bringing that into educational environments, we saw that it could actually be detrimental to what it is that we're trying to learn in those environments. And so we adapted. The challenge with hyperbolic growth and the rate of change that we're going through right now is that our ability to change as fast as the technology is changing is hitting a limit, or it could hit a limit. I will be pleasantly surprised as humanity also follows along with this. I see this as being not a tool to replace us, but a tool to collaborate with us. And so, can we find the ways that we're actually moving forward with the technology so that it does allow us to go to actually still participate? I have a friend who is using one large language model to pretend that it was Carl Jung and analyzing his relationship with his mother. And he was like, it was actually like a really good dialogue. So I was able to learn about what was going on in his life from that interaction. And like there may not be a perfect interaction with that, but you can still use it for internal discovery, and then additionally looking at how you can move forward in your role, as well as like being a productive member of society. Yeah. So I think we're at a tipping point of saying, like, how do we want to work with this technology so that we can understand ourselves better and understand what makes us want to contribute? If you look at what's happening in the course of like business, if I was to generate $10 million worth of revenue in the 1990s, I probably would require about 50 people in order to make that happen, right? As we saw the advent of the internet and then a move towards services economy and AWS, cloud computing, and just really making everything go. And we've pushed towards the idea that you can make 10 million with a handful of people now. And so that abundance is going to continue to drive forward. And as AI becomes more of an oil in the mechanism that is our own creative response, I think we're going to see us get down to businesses of one that are really supported by 10,000 people behind them. but the AI can help you in actually organizing all that information so that you can do the one thing that you love to do, that you find your purposes in this moment, and then helping you to create the structure that allows you to express yourself that way.
It is fascinating. We could go so many different ways with this. There's thoughts around what does that mean in terms of employment for people or the ability to create a living. We could go down that track quite a long way, which is really interesting. It presupposes that people already have a level of skills or can develop a level of skills that will enable them to reach that point, and which might not potentially always be the case because of social issues or even some of the things around climate change that we're going through that might end up changing our environment to the degree that it becomes difficult for people to learn and grow and stuff like that. But I want to just come back a little bit back to the product side of things. We touched on it a little bit, but there's this, at least from what I've read and from what I've seen, there's this long development cycle where some new technology or scientific breakthrough happens, and it takes 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years before it actually is, or before the world's either ready for it or before it's available as a product. When you're working with through your agency and things like that, and you're working with your customers, your clients, how do you deal with that long product development cycle?
We have some customers that want to be on the bleeding edge, and that's where they want to be. We have other customers that want to be on the bleeding edge, but their appetite isn't as large for that research and development that's required. And so the other side of it is I'm measured on results. If I'm charging you $1 million, I need to be giving you $10 million worth of value. And that's where we see ourselves being. When it comes to the idea of like, how do we actually allow you to implement AI, blockchain, or whatever emerging technology it happens to be? And some industries, emerging technology is slightly different. Like IoT is something that kind of fits into a number of industries just casually, and others it's brand new and it needs a lot of hand-holding to get through. We like to start out small. And so from an AI perspective, a couple of years ago, AI was also the rage as to what we could do with supervised learning. And so there's two things that are required for that. There's compute, right? You can buy compute as easily as possible. The second thing is data. And so if you have the data and your data is structured in a way, you can train a model to do the work or to identify things that you want it to identify. And in that case, neural networks, deep neural networks, LSTMs were the big thing that people wanted to be implementing. And what we did for our clients, we basically said, look, that process is basically data pipeline, model generation, and your goal. Your goal is always going to stay the same. Your data engineering is going to be very standardized based on where you're at with your goal. But you're going to require these two things in order to use AI. In the middle, that model, let's do that as cheaply as possible. If we can go to AWS, use SageMaker, go to Google Cloud, use their tooling, or Microsoft and use their tooling, dump that in there. Let's see if we can get 60, 70% of where we need to be in regard of what we actually can do. If the client wants to move forward past that point, saying, yes, we're happy with this and we want to go, then we'll do a custom model. Otherwise, we don't need to actually spend the money. And if, let's say, AWS SageMaker got us to 95%, you just saved yourself like $500,000 in model generation. So we try to start with something off the shelf, then go to custom.
Because custom always costs more. Whether you want it to or not, it just does. I want to circle back now, because just for our listeners, we've been throwing around a few acronyms that have to do with both cloud computing and other things in terms of technology. But I want to circle back around to the start of your business. When you first set up your business, just Walk us through that process from when you're a complete newbie to business and you're starting a business, and just through just that first beginning story.
What ended up happening is I saw the need of like, how do you actually do quality software inside of organizations? And like the agency model was a little broken from that perspective. And what I wanted to apply was let's go in, let's help your organization deliver product that actually meets the market. And so we went in and we were doing organizational consulting, helping out our clients to meet their deadlines, to meet their products, to help their teams grow and put the processes in place that actually help them contribute. What ends up happening from there is I learned that I didn't want to be on the road 300 nights a year, which I had been doing in my corporate life. And then I was like, wait, I own a business now. And I'm still doing all these things that I like travel around and building this out. What I'm looking for is transition. And so we transitioned the business to being more project based. We could still train the teams, but we were taking on a project and then showcasing to the team and to the organization what is, what a successful implementation looks like. Here's the processes that we follow. Here's the gate that we go through. Here's how we interact with the client and with your own internal team to help that move forward. And so that was a bit of an evolution for us early on in the business to move things forward and how we got started.
So did you start the business just by yourself, or did you have a team, bringing a team at the very beginning?
I started the business myself. I think it was like the first year was basically me alone, figuring all that out.
What sort of a process did you use to start bringing team members onto your business?
The nice thing was most of the things that we were doing were project oriented. So from an implementation standpoint and hiring, I really started to look at, all right, I can put somebody on this project for the next, now let me find projects for this person. I had the fortunate benefit of the business is very project based. So I know that I can assign somebody to a project for 6 months, 9 months, and we have that opportunity. And so then the responsibility becomes, how do I actually fill that person up for the next year as well? And so that is an interesting sort of challenge in itself, which as an entrepreneur requires you to start thinking in different levels. I've noticed that over time, and honestly, entrepreneurship has been my favorite self-development tool from the standpoint of you constantly the only person to blame. So how do you level up and how do you actually make those next steps? So project by project was helpful in making sure that we could actually grow. Another transition that we ended up going about was actually back in 2018. I had a little bit of, I would say, a midlife crisis in some capacity and recognized that I only wanted to work with friends. And it was this separation of work and life. We have this work-life balance idea, and it's a total BS sort of environment, right? Like, why am I trying to split myself in two and then make one side happy and the other side happy, and they all have competing interests? And so it was like, okay, no, let's take a step back. And so how can I show up in a way that actually allows for the business to just operate with friends? And it requires authenticity, it requires transparency, it requires you actually caring about the people that work in the business and also your clients in a different way. And so this was a challenge in itself, but in the end, we ended up firing like half of our clients over the course of, over the course of 6 to 9 months. We ended up just dumping them because we were like, look, this relationship is not what we were looking for. And so we made a conscious choice that we needed to move our business in a different direction. And two things happened as we were making that transition. We started looking at like compensation, and compensation for our employees started, everybody was getting paid a good wage. But at the same time, when the projects win, the business wins, right? So we started sharing more of that with the team. And then additionally, some of our employees wanted to move out and start their own businesses. And so they spun out. We started doing rev share deals with them so that it was more aligned with everything that was growing. And then that actually changed how we were doing business as well. Like AI, blockchain, emerging technology usually ends up being the reason why people hire you, but it also only ends up being probably like 20 to possibly 50% of the project. And so what we ended up realizing is we had worked with some actually good development agencies, good technically strong, who, given a good product framework, actually executed very well. And so that kicked off this idea that now we're basically going to keep the team small inside of FINdustries, but we're going to partner with the right company that has the technical resources that we need in order to execute the projects that we're bringing in. And so today, we've built up those partnerships to 60 organizations that we've worked with. And we have, our partnerships are strong to where, like, we share deals with each other. And we have about 16,000 developers that are inside our network and available to us based on whenever projects are needed. And that network was built from the change that we made to wanting to work with friends and wanting to have more equal relationships.
That's really interesting because in a very, I guess, a very cut down way, I've been through a similar process. I'm really curious about what you would see as the top couple of challenges from moving from, as you said, a project-based sort of thing to more of a partnership where you have rev share deals. What would be the top challenges for that business model?
Communication is definitely, it's an obvious answer. And at the same time, it always comes down to personalities in how you're actually going about it. And then additionally, there's a level of trust that has to be built up over time. There's two types of people in this world. There's people who just give trust free and it works, or there's people you have to build that trust with. And we've gotten ourselves in a situation where we both have to give that trust and also continue to build that trust over time. There's no way that it's something that you should expect somebody to show up and really understand that you're saying everything that sounds great. We have a new product in development, and I have two business development people. And one guy was like, "Hey, how do you see this working?" And I was like, "Look, I got a pretty standard model. We develop the product. We need to find somebody who wants to pay for the development of that product. But after we cover our costs, everything that gets made is split equally amongst the partners. And so as long as we have those things in check so that we can do things roughly at a risk-free development, the upside is all shared between everybody."
Which is a really interesting model. And it's just interesting to hear how it works for other people. And it's been tried in various ways, but you don't hear it talked about as often as I would have thought in terms of a way of doing business, as opposed to a transactional type of approach where I'll give you my time and my effort and you give me your money. It's a completely different model to that.
Exactly.
I want to ask you just one more question before we start to wrap up. And that is that you mentioned that you found entrepreneurship is a really great sort of personal development way of focusing on your personal development. And I'm just curious, what have you found most useful for you in terms of nurturing that development and accelerating it for you personally?
I probably should call this 360 accountability, right? I'm not only accountable to I don't even have a board. What would a board, right? I have a group of friends that I basically share what's going on in the business, and they're pleasant enough that they really enjoy getting in there and helping out to make sure that I'm accountable from what would be strategic and board level types of discussions. And then within my team, I also hold myself accountable to them. So every team member is able to come to me and say, "Look, you've committed to doing this. We haven't gotten this done. Let's reset the expectation or see how that's going." Or it really is one of those spaces where sometimes I have to admit I bit off too much, or I'm having a terrible day and I really have to apologize to you because I showed up and my dog is sick and I just wasn't in the best mood to show up for our conversation today or what we needed to do. There's the ability of not blaming the other person for what's going on with me, or realizing that we're revamping our project management office. And I kept on asking for something. And then at the third time that I asked for it, I realized I didn't give clear enough direction for the person to actually accomplish what I was asking them to do. And that was almost like I was setting them up for failure. And so it's been moments like that where you just recognize that the outcome could have been a little bit different if I addressed what the input was to that equation.
That's really powerful because in my experience as a chief information officer, when things go wrong, it's usually not because people wanted them to go wrong. It's because the systems either are messed up and don't allow them to be successful, or I had failed in terms of clarity of instructions and things like that. So it's very powerful. And I like the ethos of going, if there's a problem, let's look at me first before I start to blame anybody else. One really quick last question, and that is, if somebody was in your shoes during that first year of starting up a business and starting to get into that process of thinking about bringing people on, what would be the one piece of advice that you would give them?
Two come to mind. So one is start with way more cash than you think you need. That is one thing that will help alleviate a lot of stress. I had a boss and a mentor who once told me, business is so much easier when profit's coming in. And it's like such an obvious statement. And at the same time, I'm like, yeah, no, that's absolutely true. I get it. The second is make your first hire before you're comfortable. You're in the process of actually building a business and a foundation, and building business isn't about you doing the work, right? So like the leader, you're the one who's actually seeing the vision for where you want to bring it. And that first hire can be scary. You don't know if it's going to work out. Even if you've hired hundreds of people in the past, this is now somebody for your business and it's your first hire. Feel free to mess it up. It's something that you're just going to learn through. You're going to survive, but you'll love the idea that somebody else is helping out make your dreams come true.
That is really good advice. Dawn, if people were interested in getting in touch with you or learning more about FINdustries, your business, where would they go?
To learn more about us, I'm on LinkedIn. You can reach me at Don Finley. Secondly, FINdustries.co. So FINdustries.co is the website to go to. And then look, if anybody has any questions or wants to get in touch with me, my email address is don@FINdustries.co.
Thank you so much for that. It's been really interesting talking with you. And we could keep going for a long time, but we've reached our time limit. But thank you so much for being on the podcast.
I really appreciate you taking the time, and thank you to everybody who's listening as well.